Chris Neilson, a doctor from the US, is tending to an injured woman on the road one day when he gets crushed by a car. He is immediately taken to the hospital, but it's too late and Chris is declared dead. His soul comes out of his body, but he still doesn't know that his life on Earth has come to an end. Later, he reaches home and finds his wife crying. He tries to ask her what happened, but strangely, she doesn't respond to him. This is when it finally dawns on Chris that he is just a spirit now. After embracing his death, the very next second he wakes up in heaven, filled with colorful flowers, glorious mountains, and kind-hearted people like him. Chris is taken aback by the beauty of the place. Some days later, his wife also dies, and Chris becomes somewhat happy, believing that they will reunite. However, she actually ends up in hell for something wrong she did in her life. Desperate to bring back his beloved wife, Chris takes help from the wisest person in heaven and travels all the way to hell. On reaching there, he finds why the place is actually called hell, filled with burning shipwrecks, souls with their bodies trapped inside the grounds, and gloomy rooms where not even an ounce of happiness is present. Chris is left with shivers down his spine. Now he only has 3 minutes to find his wife, or else he will be trapped in the desolate place forever. Following this, we are taken a few decades in the past where Chris is still alive. One day, during a holiday in Switzerland, he meets an artist named Annie Collins when their boats accidentally bump into each other. The two quickly hit it off, and this encounter eventually turns into a marriage. The couple go on to have 2 children, Ian and Marie, and the entire family lives a happy and beautiful life. The movie then fast forwards to 17 years in the future. The family is close as ever, and their bond is unbreakable. One day, all of them can be seen playing in the garden, with no signs of depression or anxiety. However, as they say, all good things must come to an end. On a fateful day, when the children depart for college, they meet with a terrible accident and pass away. 4 more years pass by, and Chris and his wife have finally come to terms with their loss. Unfortunately, God has other plans for the family, and one day, Chris witnesses a crash inside a tunnel. Several cars collide into one another, leaving many people dead and some seriously injured. Being a doctor, Chris cannot see the people suffer, so he rushes to help a woman who has been stuck upside down in her car. Unfortunately, as he is trying to help, another car comes flying in and collides into him. After Chris's soul leaves his body, an unknown voice speaks to him and keeps him company. Chris believes that the voice belongs to the doctor who is treating him, but in reality, he has already been declared dead at the hospital. He then visits his house where his dogs notice him and start barking. However, the same cannot be said for his widowed wife Annie and the other mourning people. Meanwhile, the invisible person informs Chris that he died, but the latter refuses to believe it. To prove that he's not lying, the man partially reveals himself and mentions that he can only be seen in full when Chris finally accepts his death. After a while, Chris starts going through his family photos. This reminds him of the time when their dog Katie contracted a terminal illness, and they had to put her down. I hope this movie gets happier soon. Marie was completely against it, and the family had a hard time convincing her that they simply wanted to put Katie out of her misery. Chris also remembers the time he and Ian went on a jog inside a forest. There, he broke the news to his son that they were transferring him to a new school. The scene then cuts to Chris's funeral, where he finally starts coming to terms with the fact that he has died. At the church, he again attempts to speak to her, but fails. However, Annie feels a strange sensation when he is close to her. Later, at home, Chris notices the painting Annie had made for their marriage anniversary, which is the same day Chris died. The painting depicts a mountainous landscape where the two were planning to live after retirement. In their bedroom, Chris watches Annie writing a journal to cope with his death, but it is not doing anything to help a grief-stricken Annie. Chris pities her and decides to let her know that he is still with her. He grabs her hand and steers it with a pen, making her write a message on the paper saying, "This is Chris. I still exist." However, instead of feeling comforted, Annie panics and she suffers from an anxiety attack. One day, a depressed Annie goes to the cemetery to visit her late husband's grave. Seeing her hurting, Chris embraces her from behind, but it only makes her break into tears. Annie feels like she is going insane because she keeps imagining things that can't be real. As a result, Chris finally realizes that his presence will cause Annie more pain, so he decides to move on. The very next second, he wakes up in a heaven that he has created with his imagination. The surroundings are a mountainous landscape that resembles a painting created by his wife, and is similar to a place where the two desired to spend their old age. A young and healthy Katie is also part of his idea of heaven. Just then, the invisible voice finally assumes a proper form, and it is revealed to be Morgan Freeman, the younger version of Albert Lewis, Chris's former mentor who passed away at the age of 66. Chris is happy to see him, and the latter guides him on how to use his mind to control his surroundings. It turns out Chris can make alterations to his surroundings using his mind. Albert then takes him to their residence Annie drew in her painting. There, he shows him a trick. He makes a hole in the wall, creating a beautiful and realistic world. At the same time, Annie starts painting to cheer herself up. Lo and behold, the tree she draws also appears in Chris's heaven. A young Annie also appears near the tree, so he tries to rush to her, but by the time he reaches the tree, Annie disappears. This confuses even Albert, because the presence of a living person in heaven is very unusual. He then hypothesizes that Annie Annie appeared because she and Chris have a very strong connection, a connection that even death cannot separate, and now the two are trying to reconcile again. Unfortunately, in the real world, Annie destroys her painting when she realizes that it won't bring her husband back. As a result, the tree in heaven also dries up, and all the leaves wither away. Later, Chris finds his daughter's soft toy. Oh, that's sweet. It reminds him of the time she got sick. Oh, and he had to stay home and teach her chess. It suddenly dawns on Chris that if he's found his dog, Katie, he should also be able to see his children. Chris then falls asleep, and when he wakes up, he finds Albert gone. However, a beautiful woman named Leona approaches him and reveals that Albert has assigned her to keep him company, while he's gone to guide other souls. Leona was an air hostess that once served Chris and his daughter Marie on a flight. Meanwhile, on Earth, Annie begins to feel guilty for Chris's death, as he was out running errands for her when he got killed. It's then revealed that Annie also blames herself for her children's death. She feels that if she had been driving them around, they wouldn't have lost their lives. Back in heaven, Leona takes Chris to a city filled with souls enjoying themselves. There, they watch some souls reincarnating before they go on a boat ride. Chris slowly begins to realize that the city looks similar to the miniature Marie had in her room. Leona then reveals that she didn't look like this when she was alive, and that she adopted the looks of a woman she admired. She chose to look like the flight attendant because when she was young, her father had complimented that woman. Hearing this, Chris finally realizes that Leona is actually his daughter, Marie. This creates an emotional reunion between the two, and they rejoice with a warm hug. On Earth, Annie is struggling to move on. Her therapist is trying to send her to a clinic because he's afraid she may try to harm herself like she apparently did in the past. Unfortunately, she does just that and commits the unthinkable. Later, Albert pays Chris a visit and brings him the bad news. Chris is heartbroken, but he's also relieved that Annie's suffering is finally over, and hopefully they will reunite soon. However, Albert reveals that she will go to hell because that's where people who commit the unthinkable go. Annie has broken the laws of life, and now she will have to pay for it. This breaks Chris's heart, and his heaven is eclipsed by dark clouds, but he still refuses to let his wife go. Hence, without thinking twice, Chris decides to venture into hell and rescue the love of his life. Albert warns him about its consequences, but Chris is unfazed. He is adamant on reuniting with Annie one way or another. Seeing his passion and determination, Albert eventually gives in and takes him to the Tracker, the only person who can help him navigate through hell. The Tracker agrees to help, but he warns Chris that even if they find Annie, it will be of no use, as she has already lost all her memories. Chris still insists on trying, so he, Albert, and the Tracker begin their voyage on a boat across the seas of hell. After hours of traveling, suddenly, a wild storm shakes the boat, and the lost souls in the water gang up on them. The boat immediately capsizes, and as the group tries to stay afloat, Chris has a flashback of him and Annie arguing about their son's future. It turns out Chris was putting a lot of pressure on his son to do well in college, and it was taking a toll on Ian. Eventually, the sea waves sweep the group to the shores of the gateway to hell. Surprisingly, the place is dark and gloomy, filled with shipwrecks and burning fires. The trio continues their search for Annie, but they are unable to locate her because Chris is still being haunted by the memory of his son Ian. The movie then flashes to the forest, where Chris had gone for a jog with his son. Ian explains to his dad that he is not academically gifted like him, and school is difficult for him. However, being the great dad that he is, Chris comforts him, saying that he believes in him. He also adds that if he has to go through hell, he would want nobody else but his son by his side. Relevant, but still a weird thing to say. The scene then flashes back to Ian's funeral, where Chris gave a speech in which he described the man Ian would have grown up to become had he been given the chance. Brave, thoughtful, loyal. Back in the present, Chris watches Albert preparing to fight a group of lost souls. With this, he realizes that Albert is actually Ian, and the father-son duo embraces each other in yet another emotional encounter. Chris is happy to reunite with Ian, but the Tracker tells him that he can't find Annie with his son because he's a distraction. Chris refuses to leave his son behind, but Ian tells him to go. He also admits that he adopted Albert's appearance because he's the only person Chris ever listened to. Before parting ways, he tells his dad to take care of his mom, just like he did after both his children died. Later, as the Tracker and Chris take an elevator to hell, the latter begins to think about all the things Ian mentioned. It's then revealed that after Ian and Marie's death, Annie tried to commit the unthinkable and she was admitted to a mental hospital. During this time, the couple's marriage hit an all-time low, so Annie demanded a divorce. Back in the present, Chris and the Tracker eventually reach their destination, where the floor is filled with creepy faces calling out for their loved ones. After a bit of looking around, Chris finally locates his wife's face. He runs up to her, but ends up falling through a hole in the floor and into a lake. However, he manages to swim out and discovers the place that she's at. It's a dark and nightmarish version of their dream house. The Tracker explains that the house is a representation of the guilt Annie inflicts on herself. He also reveals that he is the real Albert and warns Chris that if he stays with Annie for more than a few minutes, he may be permanently trapped in hell. Now the best he can do is bid a final farewell to his wife. After the tracker leaves the room, Chris walks up to Annie, but as expected, she doesn't recognize him. Therefore, he pretends to be a neighbor that admires her art. Annie welcomes him and expresses her concern for her missing paintings. Taking this as the perfect opportunity, Chris starts consoling her and even tries to distract her with an incident from his life. In the flashback, Chris visits Annie at the mental hospital. The doctors have failed to rehabilitate Annie, so Chris tells her that he has finally decided to stop trying to force her to be normal. He says that even though it pains him a lot to see her like this, he wants to let her be for as long as she is happy. However, as Chris proceeds to leave, Annie stops him and mentions that she wants to go back to her normal life. Back to the present, Annie thinks it's a touching story but doesn't react much. She then expresses her interest in seeing her family again, unaware that her husband is right there in front of her. Hearing this, Chris immediately makes Annie close her eyes and asks her to remember the day of her marriage. Surprisingly, Chris appears in her memory, but when she opens her eyes and sees him, she freaks out and refuses to believe that he is her husband. With this, Chris realizes that no matter what he does, he will never be able to get his wife back. Hence, he decides to tell her a few ultimate words before leaving. He apologizes for all the things he'll never give her and all the times he'd failed her. He also thanks her for everything she's done for him. Annie tears up as Chris leaves, but it turns out that he actually decided to stay with her in hell. He walks up to Albert and instructs him to return alone, saying that heaven is where his wife is. He also requests Albert to take care of his children. Following this, Chris re-enters the house and expresses his love for Annie, saying he'll stay an eternity in hell if that's what it takes for her to regain her sanity. These words from Chris parallel something that he said to Annie at the mental hospital, and because of this, she regains her memories. However, it's too late for Chris, as he has already stayed in hell for too long. He has now become a part of it. Surprisingly, when Chris opens his eyes, he finds himself in heaven once again. It turns out that he was too pure and good for hell. That's why they rejected him and sent him back to heaven. Even Annie is present there, and also the kids. The movie ends with a toy boat of a small boy accidentally bumping against the one belonging to a small girl, much like how Chris and Annie met in Switzerland. Subscribe for more videos like this, turn on notifications, and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.